Grab a cup of coffee. All right, we'll get going here in just a minute. We had more questions last time than time to answer them, so I'm going to try to get us started right at 9:30. Folks, as you come in, just grab a seat wherever you can find it. Again, as usual, the front row is very available. Let's open with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Also with you. Let us pray. God, we give you great thanks for this day, for this community, for all of those who are gathered here. We ask that you would be with us and guide us as we listen and learn, to open our hearts and minds to your presence in this place. We pray that you would be with all of those who are suffering, with all of those who are afraid, and with all of those who live in places of conflict and war. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so before we get going, just a few quick announcements. First of all, what's coming next weekend? There we go. Oh, you guys warmed my heart saying that. They say that, I forget, our communications people can tell me how many times you have to say the same thing for people to really hear you and get it out there. So I can't tell you the number of times I've made a Becca Stevens announcement, but it feels high right now. So thank you all. But we are so excited for next weekend. It is going to be a great time of community building. We have, for those of you who watch Parks and Rec, a very fall festival type thing. I don't think Little Sebastian will be there, but it would be pretty cool. So kids, youth, adults, there's something for everybody. Please do sign up, and if the cost is in any way prohibitive, do reach out. We find that people are really loath to do that. They'll just not show up rather than ask for that. We have scholarships available through a generous donor, so please let us do that. We would rather have you there than not. All right. So some of you were here last week and got to meet Dr. Clayton Whisnant. For those who weren't, I just want to do a quick introduction. Dr. Whisnant was one of my professors at Wofford College, and it is so fun to get to see you again now in this life. And I know Clayton will tell you a little bit about himself, but let's give him a round of applause. We're so glad to have you.
I had some complaints that people couldn't hear last time, so I'm just going to try holding the microphone. Not natural for me to hold a microphone, but I'll try to keep it close to my mouth. So yes, I'm not going to completely refresh my introduction, but but just quickly, I'm not from South Carolina, but I've been in the area for quite some time. Went to Spartan High, graduated in 1989. Went up to Texas for some years. Was there from 1989 to 2001. But have been back at Wofford teaching history. German history specifically is my specialty, so I do a lot of sort of German history. I have publications actually on sort of gender and sexuality is one of my subfields. But teach very widely, so have taught courses on Russia and the Middle East and theory and a whole lot of other stuff. Just know American history. I don't really know a whole lot of American history outside of just what I picked up being an American, but European history and a lot of the other world I know. Anyways, that's enough about myself. So just a quick little refresher. Anytime at Wofford I have to sort of pick up in the middle of a lecture, I always like to just really quickly recap what I did last time. So we talked just very quickly about Palestine before World War I. Being part of the Ottoman Empire, and I talked about how, and essentially what I was trying to get across from this was that there are people there. I think a lot of Americans envision Palestine as being essentially empty land when the Jewish people arrived, and that was not the case. There were a lot of people there, in particular a lot of Sunni Arabs that were there, and you can see 1870, right, 325,000 Muslim Arabs as opposed to the very small community of about 14,000 Jews who lived there before the immigration began. And then we talked a little bit about Jewish-Arab relations and how, yes, there was a little bit of conflict between the Jewish people of Medina when Muhammad took over as a ruler of that particular city. And unfortunately, some of that conflict entered into the Quran. And so there is some vaguely negative anti-Jewish language within the Quran, but actually fairly minimal all in all. It's definitely balanced off against other kind of statements about the Jewish people being people of the book, and at some level being honored as a special people who were chosen by God to receive the word of God at the very beginning of this sort of process of giving divine messages. So all in all, right, there was 12 centuries of peace and tolerance. And that's something, too, that Americans, I think, tend to forget, that we always envision this as being an inevitable conflict, a centuries-long conflict, something that just couldn't, almost natural, right, just embedded in the world, much like the laws of nature are embedded in the world. And that's not actually the case. The conflict is relatively new, especially from, we historians deal with very long spans of time, right? From a historical point of view, it's very, very new. It's only just a little bit over a century long. And so we talked a little bit very quickly about the foundation of the Jewish community, beginning with the Zionist movement that organizes a lot of immigration, especially Eastern European, Polish, and Russian Jewish immigration into Palestine. This does lay the groundwork for a community right after the First World War, the Yishuv as it's called. But this was all part of the context of European imperialism, that it was being allowed by the British who had established a mandate in the region. And the result was that for a lot of people, a lot of Arabs who were there, they connected these two things, right? That effectively the Jewish community were a set of colonizers operating within the context of European imperialism. And then we went on, I think this is maybe the last thing I did at tail end of class, to just talk about the roots of the Jewish-Arab violence. Already in the 1920s, we do start to see some violence picking up, a series of riots focused on, to begin with, immigration, a lot of anger about immigration, and the fact that Sunni Arab, the Palestinians, as we would call them, right? Palestinians were being driven off the land and enforced into cities that couldn't necessarily absorb them very well. The economy wasn't developed, so there was a lot of unemployment. In addition, a lot of resentment towards the Jewish population because there was a perception that they were being privileged, and with some good reason. In my opinion, yeah, actually during the 1920s, the Jewish population was being privileged in various ways. Not intentionally exactly, but still had a privileged position. We talked a little bit about the failures of the British administration, that in retrospect it would have been really good if they could have spent a little bit more money to have more troops and more police forces maintaining the peace. That would have helped the bloodshed from getting really out of control like it did. But it did, and in the process we see some extremist voices on both sides, Jewish extremists and also Arab extremists, who increasingly get a little bit of a hearsay in that context. And so this maybe actually is the last thing we did. And then I just very quickly went through a quick history of the wars. This is one of the reasons that it feels like it's been going on forever, because it has been a long time. Longer than any of us have been alive, right? The 1948 war is really, actually even before that, 1947, there was some civil war that was taking place, but it sort of peaked in 48 with a full-on war with the neighboring Arab countries. 1956, we get the Suez conflict, which is sort of wrapped up with the British trying to reassert control over the Suez Canal, but the Israelis were involved in fighting the Egyptians also. The 6 Days War, which was a big one, the War of Attrition, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, 1982, Israeli-Gaza conflicts, and then most recently also Lebanon conflicts. So a lot of them. And this does set up a situation that we're very familiar with. Israeli occupation of what we call Palestine today, 1967, which includes the West Bank, that little bubble right in the middle of Israel, which is on the west bank of the Jordan River. That's why we call it the West Bank. The Gaza Strip, which of course has been the focus of so much of the news. That little bit of land right there, the Gaza Strip. You've got the Golan Heights, which is that little bubble right up there, taken from Syria in 1967, and also a lot of refugee camps scattered out across the region. Refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip is essentially one big refugee camp. Some of the West Bank, also some in Egypt. All right, so that was what we did. So I'm going to sort of pick up there. So the 1990s, after decades and decades of conflict, we entered into the 1990s, and this is the time period. I mean, I was in college. I had a roommate at Rice who was Israeli by birth, at the time an Israeli citizen. He now has become an American citizen, working with computer companies. He's my one sort of millionaire friend in that group, and so he's done very well for himself. But the result was that I became very tuned at this point to a lot of Israeli politics. And anyway, Israel during the 1990s is this sort of moment when there was a lot of optimism. I think optimism that finally, after so many decades, some solutions were maybe going to be found, and that progress was to be had. And so the key sort of background of this is that by the 1990s, you do have a major political conflict within Israel between Labor and Likud. The Labor Party, which is a left-wing party in Israel, had control of Israeli politics for most of Israeli history. It's only in the 1970s that they begin to lose a little bit of the grasp of the population. 1980s, you get into the situation where it's sort of going back and forth between Labor and Likud being the more conservative party. 1990s, the Labor find themselves back in office, but I think that they feel like they need a win, right? Because they are definitely facing some fairly stiff competition from the Likud, and need some sort of win. Also, I think have some recognition, maybe better than Likud did, that this situation of occupation could not be maintained in the long run, that it was expensive, it was producing a lot of conflict. At the end of the 1980s, there was an enormous rebellion called the Intifada, which meant that the Israelis had to keep a lot of troops stationed in West Bank, and that was very expensive and also just costly for lives. Also was sort of a bad look. You had armed soldiers going up against youngsters, just throwing stones, which of course in sort of biblical metaphor, right, is very powerful. And so I think Labor sort of understood that the situation cannot be maintained in the long run, so they had to find some sort of solution. But they had to, at the same time, not appear soft, and that was a problem, right? Because Likud was always accusing them of being soft. And so you had this kind of political conflict between Labor and Likud, but Labor found themselves back in power for a little while, and the result was that you do get the 1993 Oslo Accords. Which was, again, this big moment, right? So I was at the end of my undergraduate years, and it felt like this was going to be a big opportunity. So you get the 1993 Oslo Accords. A little bit later on, 1995, a second Oslo Accords, which just sort of spelled out the details of this one. But the end result was that, first off, Israel agreed to establish a kind of an autonomous zone. There was going to be a government, the Palestinian National Authority, PNA, so there would be elections for the Palestinians that would elect a leadership for the very first time. That was a huge step. Up until this point, Palestine had simply been underneath military occupation. So to allow Palestine to have some degree of autonomy with their own semi-independent government, that was a big step. Along with this, some autonomy in the West Bank, and at the same time, the Gaza Strip. Now, it was limited autonomy. There was only little pockets that the PNA was allowed to have control over. Large strands right in the middle of the Gaza Strip, and as well as the West Bank, where the military still operated, they still had checkpoints, etc. It was clearly not a perfect agreement, but I think a lot of people hoped that in the long run, if this situation could last long enough, and if some sort of peace could be established, then Israel would feel more comfortable and would gradually withdraw the troops, and eventually you might get a fully autonomous Palestine, and maybe even independent Palestine, right? Who knows, right? I mean, that's certainly what the Palestinians themselves were hoping, but this was just the first step in a long process of eventually getting an independent Palestine. Unfortunately, in 1995, Rabin, who was the labor leader, was assassinated. Some indication that a lot of the Jewish people themselves were not entirely happy with this move, especially among the conservative branch. So this was an ultra-Orthodox Jewish man who shot Rabin, who essentially believed that Rabin was handing away portions of Israel that belonged to Israel, was part of historic religious Israel. So Rabin was assassinated. My roommate was just devastated. He was a labor supporter, but even beyond that, I think it was devastating to see this man who seemed to have a vision of maybe how it could go better in the future, to be killed. Anyway, so he was killed, and afterward, that sort of begins the decline. At the end of the 1990s, there was a lot of violence. And this is what Lakuta sort of came back and said was, well, we gave them autonomy and it didn't help. If anything, the violence just got worse. And so this process clearly is not working. What the Palestinians always insisted was that, that it wasn't clear after 1995 that this was going to go anywhere. That you gave us a little bit of autonomy, but it wasn't clear to us that you were making any steps forward from there. And there is some truth to that as well, that the Israelis were not moving very fast in terms of granting more autonomy. So there was a sense of bad faith on both sides, which is unfortunate. Year 2000, there was a final effort to maybe restart this whole process, a second Camp David. This was the pictures from that. Arafat as well as Barak met at Camp David with President Clinton. This is at the very end of the two administrations of Clinton, and as you know, second administration of Clinton did not go particularly well. We won't go into that. but Clinton needed a big win as well, right, to sort of salvage the last little bit of his reputation. And so I think there was some hope that maybe something would come out of the Camp David, but unfortunately not a whole lot did. And so it was sort of the cap to a decade where there was a lot of hope, but also in the end the process just sort of stalled. The one thing that Israel did do in 2000 was to withdraw from Lebanon. I'll remind you from the previous lecture that they had occupied southern Lebanon in 1982 to try to deal with some violence coming out of that area. And finally in 2000 they do agree to withdraw from Lebanon. So that seemed to be a small step forward, but still not exactly enough. So the result is that after 2000 we have renewed conflict and violence, right, as everybody I think knows. You not only had the second intifada being a rebellion again. First one, like I said, was mostly about young Palestinians fighting armed Israelis with rods, right? It's sort of effort at peaceful resistance. When we get into the second intifada, this is unfortunately the time period in which Hamas is really active. And so what we remember from the second intifada is just one suicide bombing after another. So a lot of suicide bombings at this point, a lot more violence, and sometimes armed violence. So that went on between 2000 and 2005. At the same time, Israel just decided, well, we don't quite know what to do, but we've got to stop the suicide bombers from coming into Israel. So ultimately, they built the West Bank barrier between 2003 and 2006. That does seem to have helped a little bit. It made crossing the border harder, and the result is that there is some evidence that the suicide bombing sort of waned a little bit after that point. But on the other hand, it is unfortunately a really visible just mark, right, on the entire terrain. And we see a wall, and we think of the Berlin Wall, we think oppression, right? It's got images of prisons, and there is some way in which the West Bank looks a little bit like just a prison, right, a large prison. And so you can understand the process that went to the barrier being built, but like I said, it's also not a good look necessarily, and sometimes hard on a lot of the Palestinians. 2006 is a big moment. So the PNA, which again is a Palestinian National Authority, had their second election. So only 2 elections. The second election was this 2006 one. This one was weird. The Hamas had boycotted the first election, but decided to run in the second election. And the result was, a disputed election. looks like maybe they won, just based on the numbers, but the PLO always sort of insisted that the elections was not entirely fair in the Gaza Strip, and so they refused to recognize the Hamas, and the result was a civil war. So there's a civil war that erupts where Hamas ends up taking control of the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, on the other hand, is still in control of the PLO or Fatah, which I'll talk more about in just a little bit. So that was a big moment where you get this political split that we now see, right, between the Gaza Strip versus the West Bank. And then of course recently, right, a renewed conflict that I don't think I have to go over initially, that starts off with a horrible incursion and kidnapping, and then just sort of goes down the hill from there, right, the most recent one. So, let me talk a little bit about what's going on here. We already talked about the reasons that back in the 1920s, right, you have some conflict. Well, those reasons have been added onto. So let's talk about some more recent points of perspective. What are the Palestinian grievances? The Palestinian grievances are real. This again is something that a lot of Americans don't realize, though I will say that Americans are recognizing this more than has ever happened in my lifetime, and more just period. A lot of young people are beginning to sort of wake up, right, to the fact that the Palestinians really are in a very tough situation, and they have some real grievances. Again, this does not mean that I agree with Hamas, right? I recognize the grievances, but I don't agree with the leadership, in particular the violence and the tactics that Hamas has used. But what are some of these Palestinian grievances? One, conquest and displacement. They've gone through decades where the Israelis have come in, destroyed villages, forced what we would call just massive displacement, right? Huge migrations of people into refugee camps. And within those refugee camps, they have not had much of a livelihood. For decades, they were living in sort of makeshift camps. Later on, there was infrastructure that was built, but still not any situation that Americans would like to live in for a long term. And they've been there for decades now. So just the process of conquest and displacement that they remember, or their parents went through, and so it's part of the family history, and they would love to get back to their homeland as they see it. Second, the experience of occupation. Like I said, especially after 1967, there were large areas of the West Bank that were controlled by the military, and that was sometimes pretty brutal too. That on the one hand, politically, it was very difficult to organize during the 70s and 80s. That the Palestinians were trying to organize, but anytime they tried to get something going, the Israelis would send in the military and arrest the leaders and keep them in prison for a very long time. The economy was rough, and the Israelis were not doing a whole lot to help out with the economy. It was very difficult to get, for example, the permits that you needed to set up a business, or of course, nobody is going to want to trade with Palestine being in the midst of a military occupation. So the experience of occupation itself during the 60s and 70s was really quite brutal, and this is one reason that you got the Intifada of 1987. The first Intifada was that people were sick and tired of living underneath the military occupation. So the experience of occupation, that was hard. Iron fist Israeli security, especially once the violence picked up. Palestinians were all expected were all expected to carry ID cards around. There were checkpoints. They could be arrested for any reason, right? For no really good reason, we would say. They could be arrested, thrown into prison for up to 6 months without even being charged. Their leadership was assassinated sometimes. So again, a kind of iron fist security policy that came along with this occupation. They also had a lot of grievances about the Jewish settlement policy. So the Likud, the Conservative Party, has been fairly tolerant of these Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox groups that tries to move into Palestine to establish little settlements, little villages, little compounds, we would often call them. And this has clearly been part of an expansionist policy, right? That the Jews, especially the Orthodox Jews, believe that if they can get people there, nobody's going to force them to leave. Not actually entirely true. The government did force a lot of the settlements to leave Gaza Strip at one point. But it's hard. It's very hard to force the settlements to leave once they get established there. And there are a lot of these settlements right around Jerusalem, first off, but also around some of the borders, which is clearly part of the expansionism, right? Trying to sort of push into areas that Palestine considers to be part of theirs, and frankly, most of the world recognizes as part of theirs. So a kind of aggressive Jewish settlement policy that, once again, has been tolerated by the conservative government. And then finally, getting into the most recent conflict, the Gaza blockade. Since the Civil War, really, the Gaza Strip has been blockaded economically, which meant that a lot of human rights groups calls it a kind of open-air prison, because that's really the situation that they're living in. There's definitely a humanitarian crisis, starvation level survival that's taking place for a lot of families and young people. And not only is food very scarce, but as especially military operations have taken place, they haven't been able to get building material in there to rebuild or reconstruct the damage. So a lot of really very real grievances. But Israelis have their own grievances as well. What they, of course, remember is a very long history of prejudice and persecution, right? Going back centuries, but of course focused very much on the Holocaust. And they see this land of theirs as their one hope, right? Of getting rights, getting retaining some sort of pride, rebuilding a nation for themselves. They believe that this is sort of their last chance, right? Because they tried out everything else, and they're willing to fight for it. So very long history of prejudices and persecution. Second, the extremists within Hamas, thinking about Hamas or other sorts of political extremists, refuse to recognize Israel. And from the Israeli point of view, right, this just means that if Hamas wins, Israel will be destroyed, and the people will just be back to the persecution and prejudice that they had been experiencing. And like I said last week when I was here, I have no doubt about it that if Hamas won, that we'd have another genocide on our hands, right? So that's nobody wants that. So refusal of extremists to recognize Israel. Continual violence. What they say is that, look, we've tried a few things and it really hasn't stopped the violence, right? We tried during the 1990s to give them some autonomy, but the result was just a wave of suicide bombings. And so we tried that route. And now the only thing that we have sort of going for us is military control, right? And it's true that they not only have dealt with decades now of suicide bombing, but areas of the North Israel have to deal with sometimes just daily mortar shells raining down around their houses. You just never know when something is going to break out. And this sort of sense of a continual violence creates a kind of siege mentality, right, within a lot of the population, that they feel like they're in battle and they don't quite know what else to do. So continual violence. And then finally, a lot of distrust of the Palestinian leaders, not simply Hamas, but even of the more moderate PLO. There was a sense that they were corrupt, sometimes double dealing, and that couldn't be taken at their word, which is true as well. It's just like, both sides have good points, and I don't exactly know how to bring these two sides together, right? It's just, it's unfortunate, but I recognize that both sides exist. So, I'll do this real fast. The added complications, there are some things that have made this conflict drag on. And again, I don't know what to do about these complications, but they're there. It's good to recognize. One, Israel and Palestine are interdependent. They're tied in with one another. There's a lot of ways in which Israel has come to be very reliant, in fact, on Palestinian labor. That there are a lot of essentially migrant laborers who moved from the West Bank into Israel to do housework, sometimes cheap labor in factories. The Israeli population has largely become stagnant, much like the rest of the Western world, right? The modern world's population has sort of leveled off. And that's the case also with Israel. The Israeli population has become largely stagnant. And the result is that they need very much the labor that the Palestinians can provide. But this is the problem, right? That they need one another and can't live with one another either. So there are ways in which Israeli and Palestine are interdependent. They can't do without one another, but they can't live together peacefully either. A lot of territorial disputes. We always focus on Jerusalem, and so let's talk about this, right? Jerusalem, at some level, international law, right? The UN has said that Jerusalem, half of it was occupied back in 1967 as part of the occupied territories, and so half of that should be given back to the Palestinians when it comes time. That's never going to happen. Jewish people in Israel are never going to get back Jerusalem at this point. They fully integrated into their state. So it's not realistic, but it is part of the territorial disputes. So territorial disputes, outsider involvement. One thing I've said to my class before was that if outsiders hadn't been involved in this conflict, it would have been over a really, really long time ago. It would have been not just, it would have been horrible, sort of like, Americans, we have our stories of the Trail for Tears, for example. It would have been something like that, right? Just a massive displacement of people, a lot of violence, but it would have been over in 2 or 3 years, and things would have sort of settled down. And I don't know if that's good or bad, right? I'm not going to have a judgment I call, but that's realistically what would have happened if there hadn't been a lot of outsiders who had been involved. So who were the outsiders? Well, a lot of Arab countries who, for their own reasons, are often very supportive of the Palestinian people, and they have been involved with all these wars that I had up there. The Cold War, so the Americans and the Soviets were for a very long time, supportive of both sides. And something I'm writing right now, I talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict as a little bit of a proxy war, right? There was more going on than simply that, but the Soviet Union was definitely providing a lot of support to some of the PLO groups and also to Syria. Whereas we Americans, of course, were providing a lot of support to Israel. So there is a way, and there's an invention of it, which is a kind of Cold War proxy war for a very long time. And then most recently, of course, Iran has gotten involved, right? And they have been supportive of Hezbollah. And then I'll just finally come around to the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. So Netanyahu is the leader of the Likud, and he is the current leader of the government. And of course, he has done nothing particularly helpful in terms of peace. That he has been very aggressive in terms of supporting the expansionist policy, the settlements, for example. He is entirely in favor of using military might whenever possible to produce security. That's what he's hoping to do. But in the long run, I tend to think anyway, it just produces more conflict down the road. I sort of understand the need of it, and I understand the response of it, but I also think that there needs to be sort of 2 tracks, right? You need to, yes, in the short run, you need a military response, right? I mean, you've got to have some sort of level of security. But like the Labor Party, at the same time, they need to have some sort of path towards peace, so that there's another option. And it's not clear to me that Netanyahu has another option available for him at this moment. So that's not been particularly helpful, or at least has added on to the complications. So let me just I'm not going to go through all these points, but let me just very quickly talk about the 3 main groups that you'll hear something about. One would be the PLO, which for a long time was simply a big umbrella organization, but we tend to identify it with one particular subgroup, which is Fatah, which was the largest sub-organization within the PLO. So it was a large umbrella organization. They are secular and nationalist though, so this makes them a little bit different from the PLO and a little bit easier for a lot of us Westerners to deal with because they are secular and nationalist in terms of their orientation. Yes, they were identified with a lot of the terrorism in the 70s and 80s, but by the time we get to the 1990s, they mostly, I'll just leave it there, mostly have put aside a lot of their violence and are mostly dealing with a lot of diplomatic routes. So they've become a little bit more peaceful in the 1990s. That is Arafat, right? Arafat, I'm sure a lot of you all remember, he was the leader of both Fatah and in the PLO. And when he passes away, his crown goes to Abbas, who is the current leader of the West Bank. So the current chairman of the PLO, current chairman of Fatah, and essentially the president of the current PNA in the West Bank. Then, on the other side, you have Hamas, which is a religious group, right? In particular, what we would call an Islamist group, an Islamic resistance movement. But it's not simply, we always hear about the suicide bombing and the guerrilla operations, but it's more complicated than that. They have a whole political dimension. They have a social service wing, so they provide youth groups and their soccer teams associated with Hamas. They provide medical health care when they can. This is one of the reasons that they're so deeply ingrained into the Gaza Strip in particular, is because they've sunk their roots really deep. And they do some things that sometimes can be really helpful. They honestly have a reputation of being more honest than the PLO does. The PLO really had become quite corrupt by the 1990s, whereas Hamas, though violent and destructive, at least is, honest about it. And, this is one reason that I think that they have such support among a lot of Palestinians. Are identified with a lot of terrorism, and they do have control of the Gaza Strip since 2007. And the final group I'll mention is Hezbollah. So Hezbollah operates out of southern Lebanon. They also are a Islamist group, but a Shiite Islamist group as opposed to a Sunni Islamist group. They are based in the Shiite communities in southern Lebanon that went to war with Israel back in 1982. It's one of these things where Israel invades southern Lebanon to try to wipe out the PLO, and what they end up doing is producing this massive Shiite reaction in response to that. And so, yes, it's a part of the product of this 1982 invasion, but they have been involved with a lot of terrorism and guerrilla operations, as you know, since that moment, both against Israel and also against the United States at various stages. They do have a lot of support from Iran because of that Shiite connection and because of the fact that they represent a kind of religious radicalism within the world. And like I said, are based in southern Lebanon, so anytime you get a conflict with southern Lebanon, like has happened recently, you're going to have a renewed Hezbollah conflict. I think that's maybe all I want to do for today, because I did want to leave a few moments. I think like 8. We got 8 minutes now for questions. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so part of the Israeli argument has been that there's never been really a country called Palestine. They just call them Philistines like 50,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But it seems to me from learning more about history that really for a couple of thousand years Israel didn't have a country either. So in terms of entitlement, wasn't there the prevalence for the last 50, 80 years having more to do with like European banking and stuff and the relationships that they had with the British?
So, wait a minute, I was following up until the very end. So, who's they when we talk about the banking?
The Israelis use the argument that there's no such thing as Palestine.
Yeah. So,
but there's no such thing as Israel.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, there obviously is now in Israel now, right? So let me deal with the Palestinian question, because that is something you hear a lot, that there's no real Palestine, right? There's no real Palestinians. What most historians would say is that all national groups are relatively created, right? None of them were born at the beginning of time. They're always created through a process of historical generation. The Germans, for example, right, came into a sense of their identity in part because of the French Revolution. Napoleon invades Germany, and that invasion, to some extent, creates the conditions in which Germans begin to realize, oh, wait a minute, we all have something in common, and that we're not the French, right, who are invading us and occupying us. And the result was the sort of birth of German nationalism in the very early 1800s. So what we have in the case of Palestine is a relatively recent version of national genesis. That is, yes, there is no group that would have called themselves Palestinian back 200 years. They would have called themselves other things. But to deny that they have a certain identity now, actually created through the Israeli conflict and through the Israeli occupation, I think is to deny how all nations actually have come about. And so it's legitimate, just recent. Yeah. Yes.
Some people advocate for a two-state solution. How do you feel about that?
So I can't imagine anything else, right, besides a two-state solution. I'm open to ideas, but at the moment it's the only thing I can envision. A one-state solution would essentially involve turning a lot of Palestinians into Israeli citizens, and the Israelis themselves are terrified of that possibility because they knew that they would be very quickly outnumbered, if not immediately, then down the road, because as we talked about, the Israeli population is stagnant, whereas the Palestinian population is actually growing during this time period. So they can't allow the Palestinians to become full-fledged Israeli citizens, and yet I think it's also the case that we can't continue this military occupation indefinitely. The Israelis don't want to do it, right? The Israelis are tired of having their young men go into war zones and face death every day. So that can't also be maintained in the long run. It's horribly expensive, and so I can only imagine a two-state solution, and I hope that's where we're going to end up down the road. I just don't know how long it's going to get there. Yes.
Over the last year, what I see on television is Gaza is essentially destroyed, and there's hundreds of thousands of refugees, Palestinians, in their own country. What happens to them now?
Well, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Historians are really good at dealing with the past. We're really bad. Seems like every time we do it, we get it wrong. So I sort of, I will preface by saying that I don't know what the solution is. I don't know. I mean, the Gaza people are going to stay there. I mean, it's hard to imagine, short of just a massive displacement, which would, I think, invoke such international reaction that the Israelis would never want to go there. I know there was a lot of talk, a lot of sort of genocidal talk that Netanyahu used at one stage. I don't think, I think it was anger. I think it was anger and not very well thought out. But it doesn't seem like that's really entirely the goal, is full-fledged genocide. The goal seems to be, I don't know if it's a good tactic, but it seems to be making the Gaza people hungry enough that they'll eventually reject Hamas and go with a more peaceful route. That's the goal. Whether that will actually happen, there's not, unfortunately, a whole lot of instances where people have actually buckled to that kind of pressure. I mean, you think about a lot of wars, right? The economic pressure sometimes could cut off war material and so on, but in the end, very rarely caused a whole nation just to buckle. So I don't know, and it, especially underneath Netanyahu, it seems like he's just perfectly happy to keep it as a big prison camp situation, and that's not good either. So I don't unfortunately have a good answer for you. I don't know what's going to happen.
I have two questions.
Yep. Yes.
The first one is, it's a footnote to the 1917. One thing I noticed that you hadn't mentioned was the Tsar's expulsion of Jews from Russia. This is a lot of Jews. Look at 1917, however. That is also the time of the Communist Revolution. And we all know the connections there.
Right.
I had to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. The second thing I think of is that the United Nations created this setup. And I think the United Nations has responsibility for creating this two-state solution. And the only way I can see that happening is by a military force, an international military force to put aside for this until Messiah returns, that Israel will accept. That would be the secular solution that I can see. I cannot see it happening any other way, because remember Masada? These are two peoples who are not Christians. They're Muslims and Jews, and they will fight to the last man. They will not surrender. They cannot.
Yeah, and but what I hope is, okay, yes, they will fight to the last man, but there's always the other possibilities. They'll somehow get along and learn to live with one another, right? Realize that the two areas are sort of interdependent. That they really rely on one another, and in the long run, will find their way into a peaceful solution.
Going back further than that, we're also relatives. We're half brothers.
Oh yeah, sure, right, yeah. And so, so there's a lot in there. I'm trying to figure out which one to respond to. So we'll begin with the first one, I guess. Yes, it's absolutely the case that a lot of persecution taking place around 1900 when this immigration began. There's a reason that the Polish and Russian Jews left, right? They were trying to get out. whether they had someplace else to go, well, actually, they did have other places to go. We just don't always want them here at the time, right? Most Russian and Polish Jews would have preferred to have come to the United States, but we had, a lot of immigration quotas, right? And going forward, same thing. Those quotas even got worse during the 1920s. And so the idea that there was no place else for them to go, right? There was, but obviously there was this idea that even if we went to the United States, it would be prejudiced, which is true, right? The United States also had a lot of prejudice at the time. So what they wanted was a nation, and that's and I can't say that was unreasonable, right? I understand why they wanted a nation of their own.
On the other hand, it was all the abuse and persecution over the centuries was not the responsibility of the Arab people. It wasn't there.
No,
It
right.
was in Europe.
It was Europe, yes, yeah, absolutely, yes.
Wait, one more question?
Okay, yeah, well, let me do the one way in the back.
Is it possible to imagine what a two-state geographically would look like?
That's true.
So, I mean, that is a problem, is that the Gaza Strip, it's the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are both very small. And really, this gets back into the interdependence, right? What always comes to mind is a situation like the Austrian Empire back at the end of the 19th century, where you had a larger empire, but then these sub-autonomous units like Hungary within the empire. And that's, I guess, what I would hope would be that there would be a recognition that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are sort of reliant on Israel for certain things, but also have a lot of autonomy and can effectively live peacefully with the majority population. That's what I imagine. Whether that would actually work, I'm still not 100% sure, but that's the only possibility I can imagine. And it's not quite a two-state solution, but it's pretty close to it.
Well,
Yeah.
I know you said historians.